video games, and virtual reality that engage citizens more deeply than conventional descriptive and argumentative communication. Matthijs' project will bring together research on democratic citizenship and narrative persuasion to identify which narrative features and communication formats are most effective and highlights. The project also highlights the central role of emotions in strengthening support for liberal democracy. Professor Rooduijn is a scholar who combines. Please join me in welcoming Professor Matthijs Rooduijn.
Thanks, Bram, for the kind words. I'm really happy to be here alive because the reason that I'm a bit late was this. There were many demonstrations and I had to deal with fire, tear gas, water, but I'm here. Yeah, there were... Thank you. Yeah. So it was a bit intense, and this is the reason I was stuck at Brussels Centraal. There was nothing running, but I was able to find an Uber and get here in the end. So really happy to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about the far-right success story. And what I will do, I will tell a more general story about this. So why are these parties so successful and what does it mean? But I will also integrate a more specific research paper. And the findings are still really fresh, so all is relatively new. We don't have all the data yet, but I will present the first data about that project. Also because it is also about storytelling, like the overarching story about the far right is as well. So I will also start with a story. I already told a story about the protest, but another story. And that story is about this little village. It's called Simpelveld. It's the village where I was born in the south of the Netherlands. And I lived halfway up a steep hill. So every morning I had to bike up that hill to go to school. But thank God, every afternoon I could roll down again, and that was much easier. And when the weather was really good, me and my friends, we would take a break at the picnic spot where this picture is taken, and we could enjoy the view there. And it was really beautiful because if you look to the left, you see Germany, and if you look to the right, you see Belgium. And that is also, you can also see that international outlook in people's everyday lives, because they would go shopping in Germany and they would go out for dinner or for the movies in Belgium. However, if you look at politics, this international outlook is not really present, because during the last elections in the Netherlands, about 40% voted for a far-right party in this little village, the party of Geert Wilders, the PVV. So there it is not really there. But of course, Simpelveld, this village, is maybe like a slightly more, how do you say it, a bigger example of a process that you see all over Europe. Just to give you some examples, 25 years ago, 3% of Germans voted for the far right, 2% of people from Finland, and 1% of the people from Poland. Or that was the other way around, but it was very tiny percentages. Nowadays, it's 40% in Poland and 20% in Finland and Germany supporting these parties. So the success of these parties has increased a lot. And you can see that in this graph. What you see here is the share of the vote all over Europe for many different types of parties: far-left parties, far-right parties, and populist parties, and parties that are both far-left or far-right and populist. And you can see that it increased a lot, and that in particular the far-right has increased, and that nowadays about 25% of Europeans vote for a far-right party, and that was about 5% 3 decades earlier. So that increased tremendously. It's a 5-fold increase. And an important question, of course, is then how? Why did that happen? How is that possible? And there are many different explanations, but one explanation that you hear relatively often is that people have become more radical. That because they have changed their attitudes, they have increasingly become susceptible to these parties, and therefore their success has increased. And indeed, it is true that people's radical attitudes predict voting for the far right. We know, for instance, that those who are negative about immigration are more likely to vote for the far right. Those who are dissatisfied with politics are more likely to vote for the far right. But it's not the case that these feelings have increased, that people have become more negative about immigration, that they have become more dissatisfied with politics. And the next two graphs show this, basically. It's based on the ESS, the European Social Survey, and it's data between 2002 and 2020. And what you see here is a sum scale, and it is about immigration attitudes. A high score refers to positive ideas about immigration, and a low score to negative ideas. And what you can see is that in the last, or between 2002 and 2020, that if anything, people have become more positive about immigration, not more negative. If you look at satisfaction with democracy, you see something very similar. There is not an increase or a decrease, but it is really very stable over time. So these feelings or these attitudes have not really changed, but support for the far right has. So that is an interesting puzzle. How is it possible that something that is relatively stable predicts something that is pretty volatile and also increasing over the years? And I will come back to that question, but before I do that, I want to say a bit more about how I conceptualize far-right parties, and I also want to say a bit more about those who vote for these parties. According to my definition, far-right parties share three core characteristics: nativism, authoritarianism, and anti-elitism or anti-establishment politics. Nativism is basically, I won't go into a lot of detail because I think for most of you these concepts are relatively familiar. But nativism is an exclusionary form of nationalism. It's a form of in-group, out-group thinking that basically says that the in-group, the nation, is threatened by the out-group. Immigrants, people of another race, of religion, could be all kinds of groups, but it's always an out-group that is denigrated. Authoritarianism means that far-right parties want society to be strictly ordered, and that people who do not who do not obey the law, that they should be punished severely. So it is really about law and order politics. And anti-elitism means it's the idea that the elite, the establishment, is not doing their work. They are only inward looking, they are corrupt, they are only thinking about themselves, and they have no idea what citizens find important. These three ingredients are often combined with each other, right? So nativism is linked to authoritarianism in the sense that the argument is that the people who break the law are exactly the outgroups in nativism. Anti-elitism is linked to nativism in the sense that the argument goes that the elite has opened the doors for immigrants, and that therefore we face, basically, according to far-right parties, all the problems that we face today. So they're all linked to each other, and it is one big discursive ideological success formula if you look at the electoral success of these parties. I want to make one, there is one thing I think we need to emphasize, and that is when we talk about the far right, it consists of two types of parties. It's radical right parties and extreme right parties. And the big difference is that radical right parties operate within the framework of democracy. They are in favor of the democratic process. They do not want to use violence, for instance. Whereas extreme right parties, they are anti-democratic. They don't want a democratic system, and they also are in favor, or at least not against, using violence to reach their goals. So that's a huge difference. It's a very fundamental difference, of course, but in practice it's sometimes, relatively often, difficult to actually make the distinction, because many far-right parties that are extremist have incentives to try to appear more moderate, because then they can attract more voters, and sometimes they cannot be extremist because that's not allowed in the country, and they can be persecuted for it. So therefore, it is a very important distinction, but sometimes it's difficult to make it in practice. There are also other factors that are often linked to the far right, and I want to mention just a couple of them. The first one is populism. I see that as a particular form of anti-elitism. It is a form of anti-elitism where the focus is very strongly on the good people, on the people's will, on the sovereignty of the people, the idea that the people are ignored by that evil elite. Euroscepticism is also often visible in Europe, of course, not outside of Europe. But there the idea is that the Brussels elite doesn't listen to ordinary citizens, so it is also related to populism. They increasingly talk about gender. The manosphere is, of course, very important. And also about climate change. They are not a green party, so they're pretty skeptical about climate change, some more than others, but it is an increasingly important topic for them. Then the far-right voters, what do we know about them? There is a lot of research. I will just mention a couple of things. The first one is that it's mostly men voting for the far right, so there is a gender gap, but in some cases this gender gap is decreasing, and this is probably related to the fact that in many countries we now see women leaders of far-right parties, so that the gender gap is still there in many countries, but it is not as clear as it was a couple of years ago. Education is really important, and it's in particular the difference between those who have a university degree and those who don't. Those who have such a degree are much less likely to support far-right parties. Economic well-being is important, so those who are less well-off are more likely to vote for far-right parties. But it's not only those who are less well-off. What is really important is status. So people who fear that their status is under threat, they are also more likely to vote for the far-right, their status or their group's status. So it is not just those who are the least well-off, but it's also the people who fear that they might become less well-off or fear status loss in other ways. Personality also is an important predictor. We know, for instance, that when we examine the big 5 personality traits, that people who score low on openness to experience are more likely to vote for the far right. Those who score low on agreeableness are more likely to vote for the far right. Those who score high on narcissism are more likely. Social dominance orientation, right-wing authoritarianism are also important psychological variables. But what matters most is attitudes. The ideas people have about immigration, about the political order, the establishment, whether they place themselves as left-wing or right-wing. Right-wing citizens are, of course, much more likely to vote for far-right parties. What also matters increasingly is attitudes about gender, about climate change. But these 3, I would say, are in research the most important predictors of far-right support. But that still leaves us with the question how it is possible. We know that these attitudes predict far-right support, but it's also clear now that these attitudes have not changed much over time, right? I've shown the graph. Attitudes about immigration have not changed much, if anything, have become more positive. Political distrust hasn't changed much over the years if you aggregate all the countries. So what is going on? I think that what we can conclude is that these attitudes have not changed. It's also not true, by the way, that these parties have clearly moderated. But what has changed is that existing attitudes have become consequential for people's voting behavior. So these attitudes have been activated. So take someone who a couple of decades ago was sympathetic to the ideas of the far right. It is very unlikely that that person also actually voted for the party. They probably still voted for a mainstream party, or they didn't vote at all. But that has changed over the years. So what has happened is not that their attitudes have changed. What has happened is that these attitudes have become more important in the voting booth. And I think that for this activation process, 2 things have changed in the minds of citizens. And the first one is that the importance of far-right issues has increased. So the salience of these issues has increased. People think that that everything surrounding immigration has become more important. And therefore, they have also started to vote for parties that argue, that make a similar argument or that emphasize the immigration issue. So the importance of far-right issues has increased, even though attitudes have not really changed much. And the second very important change is that the norms against the far right have weakened. So not so long ago, 2-3 decades, there were very strong norms against voting for the far right. In many circles, that was something that you just didn't do. And if you did it, you didn't talk about it. But that has changed. So what has changed? Some people started to vote for these parties became more popular, and citizens saw that these parties were increasingly big, they were increasingly successful, so they thought, well, this is apparently a party you can vote for, so they also started to vote for it. And that led to like a self-strengthening spiral, a self-strengthening process, according to which these parties became more and more normalized. The bigger they became, the more normal they were perceived to be, and the bigger they became again. So that was this spiral of growth. What is also really important is that far-right parties have also done the right things to actually pull these voters in. They use they skillfully use narratives that evoke emotions, and I will say a bit more about that later. But before I do that, just let me go back to Simpelveld, the village I'm from, just for a second, because I want to emphasize what happened there. I left that place exactly 25 years ago, and that was before the rise of the far right in the Netherlands. But back then, people were already worried about the things that I was talking about. So there was an asylum seeker center just around the corner, and people were worried about that center, and they were dissatisfied with how things were going. They were also dissatisfied with politics, because they felt that the government, the national government in The Hague, was not really paying attention to the region, that they were ignoring them, that they didn't know what was happening there. So these feelings of discontent were already there. They were just not voting for the far right yet. They were all voting for the Christian Democrats. It was like North Korean numbers, basically. It was in the 90% something people voted for the Christian Democrats. And that has changed a lot. Still, I think they're second, but the far right is now the main party people vote for in these regions. Just to emphasize that the attitudes haven't changed much, but voting behavior has. And I think, and I've already mentioned it a little bit, what is important is to make a distinction between push and pull factors. So on the one hand, there are push factors that are factors, socio-economic, political, cultural conditions that have pushed voters towards the far right, and pull factors that are the tricks, the strategies that far-right parties use to actually pull these voters in. And I will not pay a lot of attention to the push factors. There is a lot of research on this, so what really matters is individualization. Voters started to actually vote for to switch between parties at some point in the 60s, 70s, so electorates became available, and that increased in the 90s, 2000s, etc. So there was an electorate available to mobilize. Globalization meant that there were new issues to discuss. Globalization itself, European unification, immigration, so they, as a result of the process of globalization, these topics entered the political agenda. But what also matters a lot is more medium-term factors, so how mainstream parties have responded. At first, they really clustered together, making it possible for far-right parties to argue that all the mainstream parties are one and the same, and to present themselves as outsiders who provide something new. Later, they started to, in particular, the right-wing mainstream parties started to move towards the far-right ideologically, thereby legitimizing to quite some extent the far-right. That is a second process that happened later. But also, of course, media landscapes changed. The rise of social media was very important for these parties because they could communicate directly to citizens. The spread of misinformation, conspiracy theories has also played an important role. And finally, I think it's important to emphasize events. 9/11 was really important for the far right, but also corruption scandals in many countries, the financial crisis, the pandemic, all these things have played important roles for the far right. But what I want to emphasize a bit more now is there is a lot of research on this, is also what far right parties have done themselves. What have they done to pull these voters in? And my argument is that they're really good storytellers. They know how to tell a story. They know how to tell stories that also evoke emotions, negative and positive emotions. So many of these stories raise fear, anger, and disgust with elites, immigrants, all the groups that they portray as outsiders. but also positive emotions, emotions of pride, emotions of enthusiasm, emotions of hope. That also plays a role. Less, we know that from research, but it also plays a role. And what is really important is we know from research that narratives, stories can work to persuade people. So this idea of narrative transportation means that people really get transported into a narrative. You know that all when you watch a movie, you can really feel the emotions. Sometimes you have to cry, maybe you have to laugh, you have sweat hands, you feel what is going on there. And the argument of narrative transportation and narrative persuasion says that if you embed arguments or ideology in such narratives, it can become more persuasive. And that is something that far-right parties do and that they're really skillful at. And it's also relatively easy for them, because one type of narrative is the hero-villain narrative, right? A narrative with clear heroes and with clear bad guys. And that is what these parties also do, because, of course, their main ideological message is one of in-groups and out-groups. In-groups, the nation, the people; out-groups, immigrants, refugees, the elite, the establishment, the woke institutions, whatever they emphasize. So it's a short distance from this in-group, out-group thinking to stories about heroes and villains. So what you often see is what they do is they use a three-step structure in their stories. So just let me give you one example. The MAGA story in the United States applied to schools. First, they refer to a romanticized past. So there it is, back in the days, once, everything was still fine. In schools, patriotism was important. Common sense still prevailed. Boys were still boys. Girls were still girls. Everything was still fine. But then the villain arrived. And the villain here was basically the radical left-wing lunatics who indoctrinated the young minds with their ideas about woke, with their ideas about gender, about immigration, about climate, etc. And they caused a serious crisis that is going on now, and the country needs to be saved. Thank God it will be saved, because there is a hero, and he, in the United States case, will fight back, and that is, of course, Donald Trump, because he will make America great again. And it's not just he, Donald Trump, but the hero is also the ordinary people, right? Because the hero talks, he represents, he embodies the will of the nation, of the people. So the hero is also you, the people who are the victims of all the bad things that are going on. So this is just one example, but you can see this structure in basically all the ideological messages and the narratives that these parties tell. And you can see it in all the countries, but also, for instance, the great replacement theory is an example. All the things that are online, it's often this specific storyline. All right, so what I've told you now is the importance of these stories, of these narratives, and that these narratives can activate attitudes and make them consequential for support for the far right. But that still leaves us with the question whether these stories can also be more powerful. Can they also actually persuade people? Can they also switch attitudes? And that is something I think that is really important to study. I still think that in the last couple of decades, it was not persuasion that much that has played a role. I've shown the attitudes that have not changed much. But there is also research that shows that, for instance, populists can also fuel populism or cynicism among citizens. So to what extent is it also possible that stories actually switch attitudes, that they persuade people? And of course also, even if it's not the case that this was going on a lot in the past, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen now or that it is not going to happen in the future. So what me and my colleagues wanted to know if far-right parties, far-right arguments embedded in stories can actually convince people, can also convince people that are least likely to be convinced. Is there only activation or is there also persuasion? And now I will move to the specific study that we have done. And that is exactly about the persuasive power of far-right storytelling. With many colleagues. I think you know some of them. Lisa was here for 2 or 3 months, I think, and she will also come back. I think Nick Linders also stayed here for a while. So we did this study. Well, I will just tell it like this. It was basically an integrated arts science project, performance, where we collaborated with a musical theater company. And we did the research at Oerol, which is a musical theater festival in the north of the Netherlands. For that festival, one of the islands, the Waddeneilanden, is transformed into one big stage for theater. And we did a performance there with that musical theater group. And and that lasted for 10 days, 9 days of performances, 18 performances in total. And we processed 2,700, more than 2,700 participants. So they were actually the audience arriving there, and we transformed them into research participants. So what happened? They arrived there. They knew what the performance was about. It was a dinner with people who had very different ideas about politics and clashes that would happen during that dinner. That was what people knew. They knew that there was research connected to it. What they didn't know was that it was an experiment. So what happened was when they arrived, they received headphones and a tablet. They would sit down and then they would hear a voice through the headphones asking them to fill out a very short questionnaire on the tablet. That's what they did. And after they did it, they heard an 8-minute story told by a character. They didn't know that there were 7 different stories. So they were randomly allocated to one of those stories. 8 minutes. After that, they again had to fill out a questionnaire. After that, they watched the musical theater dance performance. It was not just, but there was a lot of dance in there as well. And after that, we again asked questions. What exactly we did and why, I will tell you in a minute. But what is most important was that we wanted to see if embedding political arguments in narratives would convince people of those political arguments. And we had a couple of conditions. We had 4 far-right conditions. I will tell you in a minute what they were. 2 counter-message conditions and 1 control condition. That was a narrative without any political message. And then, as I said, there was a theater performance, and what was important for us, so we had the narratives and the political messages. That was really controlled, right? People only heard 1 narrative, 1 political message, just 1, that were linked to one of the characters. Later, the musical theater performance was the same for all participants, so that we couldn't really control. So for us, the first one was real, that was like a high internal validity. It was a real experiment with a control condition. The second part, where they watched the performance, was more ecologically valid, because they could see all the different perspectives, also clashing, how they responded to each other. So that was more how real life works. Information environments are not just about one message, one narrative, but about different narratives and messages that clash. So the question is, can these far-right parties actually persuade a least likely audience? And why a least likely audience? I've just shown you that those who vote for the far right are those who are university, who vote for it are, no, let me turn it around. Those who don't vote for it are university-educated people, scoring high on openness to experience, people who are left-wing, and people who, what am I forgetting? And there's one more thing, but never mind. We already knew, but we have also measured that at the festival, this is exactly what the audience looks like. And you can see that over here. Left-right ideology. This is the left, this is the right. About 85% scores left of the center, so pretty left-wing. Gender, female, male. We had only 7 people in the other condition, so we have left it out here. But it's 70% women. Openness to experience, I think it's more than 95% scoring on the more open part of the scale. And this is education, this is university, and this is applied sciences, together about 80%. So very theoretically educated. So indeed, our sample was pretty biased, but that's exactly what we also wanted. So just to give you an impression of what was going on here, you can see that it was mostly women, by the way, as well. You can see that they received a tablet and headphones. Here you can see that they were sitting, it was, by the way, outside in the dunes of the Schelling in the forest. They were filling out the questionnaire. And here you can see just one picture of the musical theater, the dance performance. And these were the characters, and so people were connected to one of them, right? So just let me tell you a bit more. How much time do I have? Yeah? Okay. Let me tell you a bit more about the monologue experiment. So we had 6 political messages and 6 corresponding attitudes. So the first one was nativism. I've just discussed it. It was basically the message that immigrants pose a threat and that the borders should be closed. Populism was the message that there is a corrupt elite that doesn't listen to ordinary citizens. A protective masculinity, there were 2 treatments about gender, is the idea that men are strong and women are weak, and that men therefore should protect women. The threat-wife message is the idea that women, the force of women is at home. They should stay at home, basically. These are the 4 far-right messages. We also had counter-messages. So the tolerance message says that society, well, that diversity and pluralism is something we should celebrate, something that is really good for society. And caring masculinity means that real masculinity means that people take care of each other, not that they dominate the other gender. So that is the 6 different messages and the attitudes corresponding to them. We have measures. We asked people to what extent they agreed with this, just before and just after they were exposed to the narratives. And then we had a control condition, I already said it, where no political message was integrated in the narrative. And just to emphasize, of course, these characters were different, right? You saw some were male, some were female, some were non-binary, some were older, some were younger. Together they turned out to form a family. That is what the audience discovered. But what is really important, in the narratives, they were different, told by different people, but they were told by the same voice. The length was the same, the structure of the story was the same, the strength of the political message and the personal things that were being told were relatively similar. So we tried to keep that as similar as possible. Of course, it wasn't entirely possible, but not fully similar, but as similar as possible. Okay, let me show you the first results. So what you see here is this for each. So I will show this to you for each of the 6 different treatments and 6 different attitudes. So this is nativism. So what you see here is the control condition, and this is the treatment condition. This is pre-narrative, this is post-narrative. Pre-narrative, post-narrative. What you can see is that in the control condition, people became less nativist. Here you can see that the pre-post is statistically significant. So people became less nativist. Why, I don't know, because in this narrative, the person told about birds, about the family, nothing about politics, but something was going on there. Here, in the nativism condition, that was a person who worked in healthcare, and she explained how she became more negative about immigration. Here you can see that people who have listened to this story actually became more nativist themselves. There is a statistically significant change, and also if you compare the change here to the change here, you can see that over here, you see that it is statistically significant. So this confirms what we expected, that people would be convinced by a political message once it is expressed within a narrative. In populism, something different is going on. Nothing happens in the control condition, but here you can see that people become less populist. Why exactly, we don't know. Our impression is that it has to do with the character, but we don't exactly know why, and I can tell you a bit more about it later. But there is no significant change. Protective masculinity, there is. So no significant change in the control condition, but here you can see that people who were exposed to the story of the protective masculinity guy. He basically told the message that the reason why he found that men should protect women was that once he experienced violence and that his dad was not able to protect his family. And therefore he wanted to really be there for his family and to protect them. So people were really like engaged in this story. They could relate to this person, and probably that was what we expected. They would also agree more with the idea that man should protect women. And also the difference with the control condition is significant. This is the strongest effect, the Treadwife effect. So nothing is going on in the control condition, but in the treatment condition, people became much more agreed, much more with the idea that the power of women should be at home than before. So it really changed their attitudes a lot. Why exactly this was so strongly here, we don't know. We have several ideas. The first one is that this message, the Treadwife message, is of course less radical than the protective masculinity or the nativist message. It is about staying at home. It is not about men who should dominate women. So it is not as radical as that. The other one is that people probably maybe were better able to connect to that character. So that was part of the storytelling. One other reason could be, and this is something we still need to investigate, it could have to do with the audience. 70% women, older women as well, so it is likely that they could identify with this message. That is also something we heard later. Tolerance, not much is going on, but what is interesting is that, I mean, there is an overall significant effect, but it is only because there is a decrease in the control condition and only a very slight, insignificant increase in the treatment condition. And I think that it has to do with the fact, well, that there is a ceiling effect here, that it is the values are already pretty high. A similar thing in the caring masculinity condition, there is a negative effect in the control condition. Again, this is something that we need to investigate, but not much is going on in the treatment condition. All right, so this is interesting, but the question is why people became, in some conditions, more convinced than in others. So what we wanted to investigate is to what extent in the different conditions people actually felt transported into the narrative. So we measured 4 things. We measured to what extent they felt transported into the narrative transportation. We asked about the extent to which they identified with the character they were linked to. We asked to what extent they thought that character was sympathetic. And we asked about emotions. We asked about anger, fear, disgust, enthusiasm, pride, and hope. And we averaged them all, just to measure emotionality. It's a very rude measure, or a very, it's a measure that is not really, I don't exactly know what it means, but it does show us something, as we will see. It's like a measure of emotionality. So you can see it here, and I present them all together because they show the same picture, and it's interesting to see. So this is transportation, sympathy, identification, and emotions. And this is the clearest, sympathy. So here you can see that in the control condition, the Treadwife condition, the tolerance, and the caring condition, that the characters were seen as relatively sympathetic. Whereas in the nativism, populism, and protective condition, much less. The reason is probably because people agreed with those characters. Left-leaning audience, as I said, it's pretty clear. These are the right-wing attitudes, and these are the more left-wing attitudes, except for the Treadwife, but they're a different logic probably holds also because this person, well, her message was less radical than the nativism and protective masculinity messages were. Not as strong, but you can see the exact same pattern here with transportation, identification, and with the emotions. It's almost the same, so they point into the same direction. Then the question is, to what extent do these variables, transportation, identification, etc., predict actual attitude change? And that is what we examined here. And what you can see is that for all the left, the effects to the left are the effects of the far right conditions, and the last 2 effects are the counter message narratives. And you can see that in all cases for transportation, sympathy, identification, and emotions, for all these effects are statistically significantly predicting attitude change. So the more people feel transported, the more they identify, the more they feel emotions, the more they change their attitudes. This is not true for the counter messages, only here, by the way, but not in the others. And that is probably due to ceiling effects, I think. So I think this is really interesting, but what is also really important is to examine what happens in a more chaotic environment. What happens when people are not just exposed to one single narrative, but when they see different narratives, different political messages that clash. And that is why we also asked the same questions again after the whole performance. And we wanted to know whether the attitudes changed again. So I will show you that in a second. What is important is that we have fewer observations here because some people dropped out. So I will only show the results for those respondents for whom we have like 3 time points available. So here you can see it for nativism. So what happens with nativism? There is an increase in nativism. It's statistically significant, but there is a statistically negative decrease again after the performance. And it goes back to a non-significant difference with time point 1. So actually, basically, the attitude veered back to the attitude the person had before. In populism, yeah, you can. It was decreasing, right? It was a bit of a strange effect here, and you can also see that between the first and the second, there is a significant difference, but it is in the opposite direction. And between the second measuring point, and the third one, there is no statistically significant difference. Protective masculinity, again, it increased after the monologues, but then it also slightly decreased, and that made the overall effect non-significant. Threadwife, we see the same pattern, but the result is slightly different, so a steep increase. Here we can see that there is a decrease, but not that strong. So there is still a significant difference between time point 1 and time point 2. Tolerance, not much is going on. Caring masculinity, also not much is going on. What does it tell us? I think it tells us that when people are exposed to narratives, they can be very persuasive. But when they encounter these narratives in a conflicting environment where more is going on, the effects are less outspoken, and that makes also a lot of sense. We still see, however, that in the threadwife condition, the effect remains, even after being exposed to all the other stories. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, the first one is that narratives can help the far right to mobilize voters by activating existing attitudes. That is what we know. But this study also shows that narratives can shift attitudes. But, there is also a but, these effects weaken when the environment, the information environment is more complex and conflicting. Transportation, identification, sympathy, and emotions drive persuasion. I think that is a very important conclusion. But I also think that this has far-reaching implications. So this raises, to some extent, the question whether the far right can grow even further. So this activation argument basically says that we have the attitudes, and the attitudes are activated, and that leads to an increasing far-right support. But my argument for a long time has been, well, but there is a ceiling at some point, because people do not change their attitudes much, so at some point support for these parties will not become larger. However, if they manage with their stories to actually make people who are not very susceptible to their ideas susceptible, that can change things, and that can mean that they will grow even further. So that is something that may happen, we don't know it, but it is an option that we should take seriously. One step further, I think it means that we can conclude that narratives can weaken liberal democracy. The protective masculinity narrative, the nativist narrative, they are not compatible with the idea, several of the ideas of liberal democracy about minority rights, etc. So these narratives can be used for very dangerous purposes. But I want to close on a more positive note. They can also strengthen it. We have done a study with some colleagues where we examined to what extent integrating boring information about liberal democracy, about checks and balances, pluralism, well, you may find it interesting, but many people will find it boring. If we integrate that in narratives, if that can be convincing, if we can persuade people of the importance of that. And we've done that in a large intervention study where we told people about these values, why they are important, but it was told by a character that they could relate to. It was someone who is a refugee in the Netherlands because in her country she couldn't do her work anymore, and she tells this story. We did that in an intervention study with 15 interventions in the Netherlands, and I can now nicely link to Mark Brandt's story. I think last week or 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago he was here, and he did a very similar study, an intervention, replication, and he examined to what extent they had unintended effects. We use several of the same interventions, and we examine what the effects are. So for instance, just to give you an idea, we have this narrative I just mentioned, but we also have an intervention where we correct misperceptions about democracy. We have an intervention where we emphasize our common national identity. We have an intervention that is about the positive consequences of contact. That's the Heineken commercial I think he has told you about. And we have also several other interventions. The effects are here. So a negative effect means that people become more positive about liberal democratic values. You can see the Heineken video is this one. So there is an effect, but it's not very strong. This is an information video about the rule of law, also has an effect. The common national identity also has an effect. But the strongest effect is this one. It's the liberal democracy narrative. And that, well, can give us some hope that also we can use these narratives to also communicate values of liberal democracy. And in a time when liberal democracy is under pressure, I think that is good news. That was it. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthijs. Very, very interesting. I'm going to give the floor to open the floor for questions. And who wants to go first?
Thank you. It was very interesting, Paulo Rocha. In the past, I dealt with Brexit. You focused more on narratives, but there are the facts as well. And my question is, where is you consider that the negative economic environment could also trigger more extremist and more radical behavior from the people? There are studies on this. I would like that to elaborate a little bit on this. Thank you. It was very, very interesting, your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of research here. So I think it's important to make a distinction between economic circumstances at the aggregate level and the economic personal circumstances, right? So people who are less well off or who fear status laws are more likely to support the far right. It's not the case that when the economy is not performing well or there is a lot of inequality, that automatically leads to more support for the far right. It really depends on the situation, because it could be that the less well-off are more likely to vote for the far right, but you also can see different things. For instance, if things are not going well economically, it is likely that the political discourse will be about economic issues. And that is something the far right does not like, because they want it to be about immigration. They want it to be more about cultural issues, about identity questions. So what you can see is that when this happens, that's actually good news for parties that emphasize socioeconomic issues, like social democratic parties, but also some conservative or liberal parties. So then you can see that also it can lead to, it doesn't lead to success for these parties. And in fact, what we have also seen that in one study we did, that the less well-off are actually more likely to support the far right when the economic circumstances are positive. because then they one explanation could be that they then have the guts to experiment with new political choices, for instance. There are different explanations as well, but this is just one. There's a lot on the situation of the economy, inequality, at the aggregate, at the individual level, but this is just one part of that whole literature. But there is a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll have the next question. Thanks first for the presentation and congrats for the very nice study. I think it's really impressive, and also the idea of going into a real event to reach such a large group of participants. It's very, very convincing. But I was a bit surprised by the conclusion when I was comparing it to my reading of the different graphs that you've shown, where you have the 4 clusters of respondent and the 2 control conditions and the treatment condition. Because indeed, what you show is that there is a significant effect, so that means that it's persuasive. But the conclusion might also be, yes, it's persuasive, but the effects are so tiny that basically, if there is, and you've shown, the far right success story is really broad. So they move from 2% to 20% and from 2% to 40%. So the conclusion might also be first, it's probably not about their narratives, because the effects are so tiny that it would only explain a very small part of that broader story. So could that be another reading of your findings? Second, the move that we see remained rather low in the scale, so that's basically people moving from position 1, 2 to position 2, 3. So basically they are a bit less close to those messages, those narratives, but they don't really become open. So I don't know, because here I can't really tell. But if you look at the share of people or the size of the group that is above 5, that size might remain very marginal. And so most of the changes might be on the lower end of the graph, which would then just say, those people have heard a nice personal message. They don't want to be harsh and say, I reject it straight immediately. So I'm just a bit less close to the message, but I'm still rather on the side of I don't support that message. And so that these are the first two elements. And then the third is about the narratives themselves. The third point is about the narrative themselves. So there are personal stories, if I'm correct. And so how easy is it for parties to convey such narratives? Parties convey narratives that are about broader problems. They are part of party manifestos. And so if what we see is that the effect is mostly about personal stories, those personal stories might be much more out in the media, actually. When the media would report about somebody who is telling about a personal experience. Or it's about the normalization, that you would tell those stories to your friends. So is it really something that far-right parties can control directly? Or is it more an indirect effect that we would observe with such narratives?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very valid points. So here, and I agree, the effects, except for this one, are tiny. But here it's pretty strong, and here it's a bit bigger. But I agree, it's not very strong effects, and of course they also veer back. And I think we will also be very careful in our interpretation of that. So I think we will say the attitudes change in this like close information environment, but they veer back once, right? But not always, not in this stratwife condition. Something is going on there. And you're right, it could be that it is that people just don't want, it's more social desirability, right? That this person was sympathetic, so now I will agree with it. It is possible that is the case. I don't think we can actually find out if that's the case. But even if that is the case, that still points to the process we're thinking about, right? If that happens in real life all the time, there will actually be an effect. So I think that is important to note. So your last point I think is really important. So there is a distinction between the big narratives about the great replacement theory, the MAGA example I just gave, and these stories about one person. So it was about Merel. She was the person working in healthcare and why she became negative about immigrants. So you focus on one person, her personal life, what she did, how she thinks, etc. And this is not what you see in an election manifesto, of course. But what I do think is not only on social media, but also in political debates, that in those discussions, debates between politicians, more and more often, they take a very concrete example of one person and they refer to that person, and that person actually becomes part of the debate. That can be a non-existent person, but it can also be an existing person. So for instance, in my country, the Netherlands, there was this situation where one person in a debate became part of the whole immigration debate. And it was about her story. So it is something that does happen. I agree, it's not part of the election manifestos, but political parties can use personal stories just to give an example of what is going on. So many people, if they see a graph about increasing inequality, for many people, for us, that's beautiful, a nice graph, it's very interesting, but for many people it's just a number or a figure. And if they hear a story about someone who experienced something, it has a much stronger effect. So I do think that politicians know that and increasingly also do it. But it is true, the overarching message is more the bigger story. But it would be an interesting study, by the way, to examine to what extent these smaller studies have become part of political discourse. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthijs. Fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed both the framing and the specific experiment. I have a few interrelated questions. And actually, I'm going to start building on Jean-Benoit's point, because I had exactly the same thought at a certain point. It's not how big is the effect, right? It's whether the effect trip you out of a tipping point. So when I was thinking, right, because you are looking into something cognitive here, right? Do I make that cognitive? Can you push me a bit more that way? And I was thinking, after that I hear the news, for example, which are stories in a sense, and I hear something about rapes or maltreatment among children. I mean, I am in a certain part of the political spectrum, and in those moments, I have talks that I don't agree with, right? But it's a moment. I hear that thing, the thing hits me, but you won't let me, I mean, I wouldn't be pushed to vote for something so far from me. So for me, it's not that you find the effect, it's is that a tipping effect, right?
Yeah.
So related to the far right, but I see the value of having to show that the narrative does something to the cognition. But then also related to this, it's how long that effect is, because you also see it jumping up and down. So I think you have here, I think the biggest you have two big limitations. One is the sample that you mentioned yourself. It's a very leftist old woman, 70% woman. But it's also that you cannot follow them through time and see actually what happens when you repeat something. Because there is something that you said about your hometown that really hit me. You told me, yeah, these people were voting 70-80% for Christian Democrats, and now they vote for a far-right party over, I don't know, 20 years, 25 years. And that's something different, right? In the sense that it's not like you came from a municipality that was super left-wing, and then they were pushed to vote for the far right. They already had a conservative idea, and that idea, being already in that conservative side, over a lot of years of narrative, they managed to be pushed. So I wonder whether you have an idea of, because for me, I think we know that there is a lot of literature that says that it's really easy that people switch ideological blocks. You have to be in the center or in the right to go towards the far right. It's really unlikely that you will jump from the left to the right. So I wonder whether you could try of replicate this in a completely different setting. There are festivals, there are places that are mostly far right, and I think there you're going to see very different effects. But here I think the way the sample is, you are just going to find something small and temporary, and you can make the cognitive point, but not the tipping point, I think. And the last thing on the third wife, again, 70% women who probably left their kids home to go to a festival. I would define myself as a feminist. You would have moved me with that story. I would feel guilt that I'm failing the expectation. So I really think that what you have here on the third wife, it's caused by the sample. I am 100% sure you control for gender, but this especially, I wanted to see the effect across men and women. I would be really curious to see where, if there is a difference, and I bet you would find a difference. But I think I'm really sold on the cognitive part. I'm looking forward to see something that is focused on the mainstream right.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, these questions are nicely interrelated. So the first comment, basically, I fully agree, and I think what you say here is what we should put in the paper, because I'm also still struggling how to exactly do that. But what you say is that these effects, the question is, so in real life, and if you encounter something like this, you may temporarily also think, well, now I agree, but then you would say to yourself, no, this is something I don't agree with later on. I think this is exactly what we find here. This example is, so we found an effect with the least likely people. Indeed, it's a very conservative test in that sense. So I think, but I don't know, but we could take a look at that. What is interesting, of course, is what happens if people are exposed to that story on and on and on. And then it is about not people like you who are pretty feminist, but people who are slightly less feminist. They're not far right, they don't support far right parties, but they're a bit in between. It would very well be possible that they are convinced at some point when they are repeatedly exposed to such a message. This is indeed something we need to study, and it will be interesting to examine it in at different festivals. Having said that, and this is an answer to the two other questions, we have examined to what extent these effects are moderated by several variables, and gender is one of them, and there are no differences. So that is really interesting. But also when it comes to education, when it comes to ideology, and when it comes to personality, there are some tiny differences, but not, and I forgot where exactly. But overall, the effects are very similar across the board. So that indicates that this is not something that only happens among the slightly older, progressive women at attending a festival, but that maybe it's something broad. Well, attending a festival, we don't know because it was only at a festival. So that is something that I haven't shown here, but the moderation effects are basically not statistically significant. But I do think that it would be really interesting to do maybe only the monologue experiment also with a more representative sample. We could actually also do it online because we just need the people to hear it. Just to close, of course, showing them the theater part already that also already shows us what happens when we ask the question again later. We have also reapproached the participants, and we have about 700 who responded, but I haven't done the analyses yet. But we could, and that was 4 months later. But there is almost nothing left after the performance, so I don't think that there will be much left 5 months later, but that's an empirical question we still need to investigate. Thanks.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is related to your conclusion regarding the narrative shifting attitudes in a more complex and confrontational environment. Does it mean that the mainstream parties, if they confront the narratives from far right parties, this could shift attitudes? This is the first question. Second, I have to thank you for your work with Van Kessels in establishing the link between populism and Euroscepticism. I draw a conclusion about 4 case studies, and it matches the link that you established between Euroscepticism and populism. I'm very happy for that. I just have a question. Do you think that the common denominator between Euroscepticism and populism is in the soft and hard. I mean, is European Union anti-establishment and anti-elite? Thank you.
So first, thank you also for the compliment about the study with Stijn. I will let him know. I think so. What we see here, of course, is that once people are not just exposed to an individual story or an individual message, but see the different messages and how they relate to each other, how people respond to each other, that the attitudes veer back. That may be an indication that confronting far-right parties with their ideas and coming up with very different ideas and show them, well, this is how we think about it, and let's have a discussion about it, because that's basically what happened during that dinner, during that performance, right? It was different people with different ideas, the views clashed, they had a debate, etc. There also was a lot of fighting. I hope the politicians won't do that, but that's. But I do think that is also what is going on. But of course, it is difficult to really make that link and to say something, because it's a completely different arena, the political arena, compared to this personal arena. But overall, I think we show that messages have less of an effect once they're part of a broader ecosystem with different ideas, compared to the situation where they're just one single narrative that people are exposed to. So populism, Euroscepticism. The last part of your question was what hard.
The common denominator between hard Euroscepticism and soft Euroscepticism. Is it European Union, anti-elite, and anti-establishment?
I think that for most of Euroscepticism is, to a large extent, maybe not fully, but a form of populism or anti-elitism, anti-establishment politics, anti-institutionalism as well, that focuses on the European elite. It's about Brussels bureaucrats, as I have just said. But it is also slightly more, because it could also be about institutions. And that's slightly different, because populism is more about elites, right? It's more about elite groups. And it could also be about countries and other groups. So it could be about the enlargement of the Union, for instance, and that therefore they are negative about European unification. And then it is also related to nativism, for instance. So it is not just one specific form of populism. I think it's broader, but I think one of the key components of Euroscepticism for many far-right parties is that EU populism part, but not the only one. I hope that answers to some extent your question. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. First of all, in terms of the effect and size of the effect, which, like, building on the previous comments, is small at times. As someone who's designing experimental study with the aim of persuasion, I think it's very remarkable you found any kind of shift amongst left-leaning audience, because as far as I understand, much of the literature, especially when it's one exposure, mostly talks about like entrenchment of the existing beliefs. So in terms of like the hook of the paper of the project so far, like that's something they found incredibly interesting. So once again, congrats on that. But simultaneously, like as you were saying, that in terms of the finding any effect, this is the least likely audience. What I wanted to ask is for you to reflect a bit on the, like, would like to hear a bit more on the medium and the setting, because one can say that whilst the audience is perhaps the least likely, it's pretty much the ideal communication scenario, right? So like people travel consciously to some place to sit down and experience story, you know, probably not tinkering with their phones and so on, like really immersed, which, as you also alluded to, is also not how majority of voters arguably experience those stories right now, right? So if it's through social media or even like cut up broadcast clips from the TV, it's often very much chopped up and, you know, 30-second clips or so. And also people, while absorbing that, are often paying way less attention and way less yeah, like they're way less intentional in how they go with the story. And also building on that, which also you mentioned at some point, and I would be curious to hear your thoughts, is the idea of repetition, which also for me, I'm a bit biased as I work with the concept of propaganda, but in general, like the idea of placing things in the narratives and like packaging them, a lot of that is, to me, resonates very deeply with persuasion literature. And when you think about it with those terms, like one of the most persistent findings is less about the quality of it and often about just insistence of it. So in the sense that even if it's, and here we can think about like bad quality AI slop generated videos that might not be convincing at the face of it, but if people are experiencing them over and over every time they open Twitter, at some point it might leave some kind of attitudinal mark that might down the line lead to behavior. So yeah, I wanted to hear what are your thoughts from, I reckon, like a bit more communication perspective on what this setting is and what it can tell us about other settings and what it cannot.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this is an audience that is least likely to be convinced by far-right messages, but you're right, this is an audience that is most likely to be transported into a narrative because they are there at a festival, they have all the time in the world, they have bought a ticket, they're sitting there, it's beautiful, so they're just enjoying it and they really are going to do their best to be transported into that narrative. So that is absolutely true. And that is something in the first draft I'm writing now we also emphasize. But what is interesting here, I think, and I'm still struggling how exactly to do that, we have, of course, these measures of transportation. And I think transportation itself here is the most important. And what is interesting is that people do feel less transported into the narratives that are more far right. But what is even more interesting is that we still see that the people who are more transported are also more strongly changing their attitudes. So I think that is something that can help us to say a bit more about this issue. Your second point about, so we don't know to what extent repeated exposure to messages and narratives will have an effect. What we do say is that if we find something, even though very small here, it is likely that if people are repeatedly exposed to similar messages and narratives, that may have a stronger effect. But of course, we don't know that. We cannot test that here. It would be interesting, but in such a context, of course, with the theater, it will not work. It may work if you design a study where you follow people and can follow them for a longer time and then expose them to, I don't know, audio messages repeatedly and then 10 times or something, and then see to what extent that has an effect and a stronger effect over time. That would be really interesting. I just wanted to emphasize that why I also think that these narratives are really important. The effects here were pretty small, but here it was also because we had a least likely sample in the persuasion part then. Here we have a representative sample, and here you have an effect of 0.25, and that's really strong. That's a standardized effect, so that's a very strong effect there. And that does indicate or suggest to me that this narrative form does do something. And I don't know too much about it yet because we still need to investigate it. And the studies that are out there are often not about politics, so it is really like this combination that is still we don't know much about yet. But it does suggest to me that this is a very interesting combination, messaging and narratives to further explore. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthijs. My name is Aline Severs, Vrije Universiteit Brussel, Politics Department. I have a comment and a question. And the first comment on the threadwife, which was somewhat atypical, if I understood correctly in the findings, or a strong finding for that. The question is, what do you capture and what meaning is attributed to that particular storyline? Now, the female audience already gives one clue, but I think it might be a mistake to assume that women in the audience are more willing to embrace the tradwife politics or the reactionary gender politics of the radical right. I think issues like Luana mentioned about guilt tripping, being reminded of parental and care duties is one thing, but also just inequalities, gendered inequalities in terms of combining work and life. Headlining today or yesterday, the Standard newspaper in Belgium shows again that women take up more caring responsibilities at home, that it is unequally divided, and probably explains the higher prevalence of mental issues and in particular burnout among the female population. So I think, and I've made this statement before in other settings, whom among us in the audience, regardless of our gender, but balancing academia with care responsibilities, would not want to be a tradwife, at least, like sometimes, part of the week, being able to be at home, etc. And so the far right does that excellently. They romanticize the past. It's an invented past. My grandmother was juggling 2 jobs, if not 3, so it's a past that was never really accessible unless for a very privileged class of women. But they give us an impression of a past that looks fantastic, in which you are not rushed, in which you do not feel guilt over leaving your children at home or underperforming at work. So being reminded of a tradwife romanticized past, an invented past, I too would be tempted as a potential audience member to say, hell yeah, give me that. So I think looking into these broader socioeconomic conditions of your female audience would be something worth exploring. As a comment, lengthy comment. And then I had a question about the plot line. So you haven't showed us an extract of the show as the theater itself. And I was wondering, so it's just a discussion of different viewpoints, but it doesn't really carry a plot. As in a typical theater, something would go wrong, there would be a drama performed on stage. So I wonder, in this sense, your plot has 0 consequences. So for the audience members being exposed to the tradwife narrative, I can be there in the audience and think like, gosh, yes, that does look tempting, doesn't it? But there's 0 consequences for me opting this way. It doesn't have the consequence of a Handmaid's Tale kind of storyline. It's not going that way. What if there would be true consequences, like what the far right is propagating? It's not just women should be able to spend more time at home and they are good at their care responsibilities, but the consequential storyline would be that they are stripped from certain economic rights and they cannot participate on equal footing in the labor market. And giving me such a consequentialist story actually would prevent me from marching in that direction. So I was wondering, if you could think a bit more about the plot line and what that actually performs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think about the tradwife mess. So maybe to start with, these results you see here, they are based on the measures before the actual play. So the synopsis doesn't matter here. It is, well, what matters is the story that this person tells, but not so much what happens afterwards. And what I think what is so interesting about Tessa, the person telling this story, is you're right. So I think what she communicates, the message, is not necessarily a far-right message. It's softer, right? But it's also, it's not that it is the idea that it's good for women to be home. It is more than that. So it's somewhere in between. It is really the power of women is being at home. So it is really about that is what women should do. So it's more than that, right? It is somewhere in between. But it's not yet this far-right message that is really about domination or... So it is, yeah, so here we're struggling because the tradwife message is in that sense softer than the other messages, but it is also more than you suggested just now. I think what will be really important is to, and I think that's a very good idea, to take a better look at this at the storyline and what exactly happens to Tessa. One thing that is in the theater play itself, one thing that is really important. So she is the wife of Wolf, and Wolf is the he's the protective masculinity guy. They're married and they're trying to have children, and it turns out that they can't not have children. So it may be that the attitude doesn't veer back that strongly because people sympathize with her and because what happens to her. That could be part of the other graph, right? So that would be really interesting. What is also really important, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but we also, or actually Lisa and Nick conducted focus groups afterwards. So we have lots of focus groups. I think it's 18 focus groups with, no, slightly fewer, I think 14 or 15 with about 140 participants. And they discussed every time one character, so the people that were linked to one of the characters. And what I know, but I still have to check more carefully, what I know is that people do say, and that women say about Tessa, that they have had to think about their own motherhood, about their own situation, and that it brought, so it is probably the case that it brought back like positive ideas about their own life, how they dealt with the situation at home, and it may very well be that that is an explanation also of why the effect is so strong. But that is something that was a result from the focus groups, and we should look into a bit more. But thanks, very interesting suggestions as well.
Okay, and now it's 2 o'clock. I was wondering whether we shall stop the discussion here, perhaps give you the opportunity to also eat something, Matthijs.
Yeah.
There were still some questions, so
I
perhaps
still have the
people
taste of tear gas on my lips.
Yeah. So if we go outside, people can still stick around, have something to eat or to drink, and then we can perhaps continue afterwards, like a more informal discussion. But thank you very much for the very interesting.
Thank you.